Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. As a reminder, please register your attendance in the meeting notes, which I just pasted in the chat. And also, if you have any agenda items, please go ahead and add them. We normally say welcome new members as well. First, I'll take the time to welcome any new members. If you want to briefly say hello, you're welcome to do so.
Yeah, I'm Victor Liu. I've been joining some other meetings, but I'm not a security expert. That's why I tend just to listen. But since SLSA 1 is now formally announced, can formally just, I guess, trying to understand SLSA, and especially in relationship to like S2C2F, and understand the whole 9 yards from here.
Great, welcome. Is there anybody else? I think that might be it. Welcome, Victor. I think Mike had the first item on the agenda.
Sure. So I know I spoke about some of this in some of the other SLSA meetings last week, but I know we canceled this one last week. So I'll go over at least some of the stuff real quick. So KubeCon Europe was, I guess, about 2 weeks ago at this point. Overall, SLSA 1.0 went over very well with folks at KubeCon. They were very excited there as well. And for folks who didn't see it, there was a few projects, in particular Argo and Prometheus, that went through SLSA v 0.1 audits through the CNCF. So that went over pretty well as well, which was nice. And then they plan to continue doing that now for SLSA 1.0. And then there's some interesting discussions happening within tag security under the CNCF about potentially requiring, like, SLSA projects for something like graduation. You must have, let's say something like this, SLSA level 2 or SLSA level 3 for your build. There's some discussions about like how we might implement that. So that's something that's kind of coming around and it's pretty cool. With that said, there was some stuff that people had questions about. One is there's a concern around, like, really right now no working 1.0 examples, and how can we start getting 1.0, what does 1.0 look like? How can we get some examples around there? Or rather, I should say, why 1.0 examples, I mean 1.0 for the spec, for the provenance spec. I know that largely stuff is still compliant, even if it is v 0.2 of the provenance spec. But I know folks are like, hey, I don't see any examples for 1.0 of the spec. There's still lots of questions around conformance. And in particular, one of the things that was kind of, actually, before I continue, Mark.
Do you mean having like real world examples, or just literally on the site, just like an example JSON file? You're muted.
My bad. Via the links, you can see the 1.0 example, and that's fine. I think the thing that people are trying to say is like, hey, what does that kind of look like? Or is there like an example here of, let's say, taking the SLSA GitHub generator or something like that? Because two main reasons for it. One is for end users to better understand, like, what are they expecting? What should that kind of thing look like? And secondarily, for folks who are building out tools, they're kind of just sort of saying, hey, what does this, is there like a good, example here that I can take a look at for my own tool, whether it's a generator or validator or verifier or something like that. So yeah, that was the other thing. There was lots of questions around conformance. A lot of folks were just like, hey, it's a little unclear to me. There's a few folks who were had good feedback, which I, around like, hey, how do we know that people are actually following SLSA and not just claiming to? And I said, well, there's a conformance program around that. There's also, I think, one of the things that came out both from KubeCon as well as some of the discussions right after KubeCon was this general confusion around what conformance means, and perhaps it being it feels heavily skewed towards SaaS, right? One of the big things was based on some of the conformance draft stuff and based on some of what we've already seen as the examples, given that somebody who makes a claim about, like, I have a SLSA conformant build system, it is very clearly, I have a running system and this is what it looks like. And that's easier to do when your entire, like, you're a GitHub or a GitLab, compared to if you're, hey, I'm a random company, I have my own, like, I have 5 or 6 different Jenkins running. Does that mean I have to have 5 or 6 different SLSA conformance there, or what does that mean? There's some confusion around what that is. There is, and then what else was there? Yeah, and pretty much lots of questions around self-hosted, like how does somebody self-host a SLSA conformant build system and provide enough data to be conformant, especially given that some of the stuff might be, hey, I'm not giving you access to my, unlike GitHub, which can be poked around a bit because it's public. How do you sort of do that? And also, how do you do that in a way where a smaller company doesn't feel compelled to just use GitHub, let's say, or GitLab or Circle CI or, another SaaS? They might feel a little bit pushed in that direction, that's the only viable, less costly option. And so that was actually a thing that we were talking about also in the tooling side, that it might, if tooling can make it very easy to at least provide a report or something like that of a SLSA compliant build system, and so that folks can just sort of push that out, that might be useful. Anyway, that's I think those were the main things, and then there was just some general thoughts, which was like, hey, they'd love to see more examples generally, more sorts of like, hey, if you're this sort of company, these are the sorts of things you're doing, that kind of thing, which I think that'll come with time. And then a lot of questions around, hey, they would love to see examples or demos of, like, we tried to do a thing, you have SLSA 3 compliance, cool, this is how we detected that thing, or we detected or remediated against that bad, that attack. Anyway, that's pretty much all the feedback regarding KubeCon.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I would like to, personally, I would like to try to work towards addressing these sorts of things, like, because actually this rolls into Andrew's next topic of, like, where do we go next? I would like to, have active work on getting, because all these are kind of things we kind of knew about going in, but didn't have time to address. Yeah, this could be a help us prioritize what to work on.
And I talked briefly with Chris and Michael both. I know Chris has a he'll be at a conference next week, I think, and Michael just went to one, and I'll talk to some people tomorrow. But we're thinking about doing some type of SLSA 1.0 plus 1 month type of blog post to address some of these potential issues and try to clarify some of them just in a blog post. So maybe being able to shed some light on some of these types of questions and issues. To address your question, Trishank, that was one thing that we're kind of asking, or Chris and I are asking each other about whether this might be better for our FAQ. I was arguing that some of these might be a little bit more long form, to try and represent some of the reasoning and logic behind it. But that's not to say that a blog post couldn't also be coinciding with a FAQ update for some shorter form of these. So I think that's still a valid comment. If nobody else has any other comments on what Mike presented, I can just talk about what I was looking for. So I know that there is a roadmap, but that roadmap for 2023 is not specific in terms of what a plan is, when we want to try and start working on the next iteration of SLSA. And so I was just curious what thoughts were around it. I know that Trishank had some comments in Slack as well about a comment period. And so also kind of maybe trying to think about what can be done while waiting for a comment period. What should we wait to hear back from comments? Melba, your hands up first.
Yeah. Hey, Andrew. Yeah. So I presented the roadmap to this specification group as well as the overall SLSA group. And the consensus was that they didn't want to put timelines. They didn't want to make it too specific. They just wanted to say, this is what's next. And then, or this is what we're going to work on next versus, future, because we haven't been great at timelines. So that was just the feedback that the group had for the roadmap, which is why it's the way it is. And so obviously we're all volunteers. So if people want to volunteer for a specific thing, I think the priorities are the ones that are up top. So I just wanted to give you that background if you weren't on those meetings.
Yeah, I wasn't on those meetings. I was a little bit of a late joiner to the community, so I didn't get that full background. And I understand that there are no timelines committed for the overall priorities, but that doesn't mean that we can't identify maybe some shorter timelines, some shorter comment periods or whatnot, for being able to help grow the specification as it's currently presented. Mike.
Yeah, so one of the things actually I forgot to mention was some of the stuff that folks had brought up at KubeCon, some of the feedback I got regarding the build tracks. I'm sorry, regarding the different tracks. And just to be clear, overall, they really appreciated the difference in tracks so that they understand like why we pulled out. A lot of folks had questions like, hey, why exactly did you stop doing 2-person code review again? It's like, well, it's not that it's bad, it's just that we wanted to separate out the build from some of these other pieces. I think generally, and I know this doesn't help, is generally there seem to be folks who wanted a little bit of everything. Like you had folks who were like, yeah, I'd love to see the source stuff get fixed up a little bit more. You had folks who were asking for, I know we had talked about this, maybe something like a build system track. I can't remember who had brought this up previously, but around, hey, like what does it take to make a SLSA a SLSA secure build system, or a build system that can provide secure SLSA provenance, that kind of thing. So there was some stuff around that seemed to be less of a concern. They sort of felt like a conformance program or whatever would help out there. But the other big one was SLSA level 4, even if it's like aspirational and not per a spec. I think folks really want to know that SLSA hasn't forgotten about the future steps and some of these other things, because I think some of the comments I had gotten were like something akin to, oh, was Salsa forced to lower its standard because other people can't hit it? And I was like, no. It's more because of confusion around what hermetic means, around, what does it count? Like what counts as repeatability versus reproducibility versus whatever. So I think those were the big ones, with the two big ones being source and like hitting, L4. And then with a secondary thing of like, hey, even if folks got pointed in the right direction of look at this other specification for secure builds, we think that if you generally follow these rules, you'll probably be SLSA conformant. I think that that's something else that folks were really asking for.
Just to poke on the aspirational comment, I think that one bit of feedback that I've heard is that there's really a desire to be able to have bars set and metrics defined that are measurable, so that it can be potentially continuously validated that builds are actually conformant to these build systems, assuming you have some kind of platform level, maybe conformance, but then any kind of additional requirements on top of some base platform really should be defined in a way such that proper metadata can be associated with it in order for it to be automated in its acceptance. Trishank, do you have a comment?
Yeah, thanks. This may be, well, anyway, I think this might be said somewhere, but if not, it might be worth pointing out, is that it looks like, and correct me if I'm wrong, so we're certainly focusing on the build track. I think we've sort of implicitly, if you think about it, Salsa can be broken into 4 separate tracks, right? It's build, obviously, it is the package track, which I'm not sure we talked about, is the dependencies track, if you want to call it that. And then the source track, which we're planning to maybe go into Salsa 2.0. But it might be worth pointing out that if we're not planning to work on some areas, so for example, I think dependencies track is one of them. We talk about how you might integrate SBOMs into Salsa, but we don't mandate anything. I was just wondering whether it's worth clarifying that. Again, we don't have to do it now, but might be worth clarifying, following Michael's comment earlier.
So does that speak to a process? I think that like what Melba shared now, that first bullet process for creating tracks, is that kind of what you're getting at? Is it doesn't necessarily only have to be 4. It's whatever can be encapsulated in a coherent track, which has progress going from some 0 level to some higher level. It doesn't even have to max out at level 4 or something like that. Is that what you're talking about, or was there something else that you were thinking of?
No, I think we're on the same page, right? It doesn't have to be just those 4 tracks, but at least in my mind, those are the 4 broad tracks, and then we can split it as much as we like.
Oh, I think David had his hand up, but I noticed you put it down.
I was debating putting it down. I'm going back to the conformance to the program and talking about all this tooling and as just when I first joined the group here, and I've been listening a lot over the last few months. I think I stressed that I was a former auditor, and that's one of the reasons why I joined SLSA, is to kind of talk about how do we do the attestations, how do we actually get to a point where people not only trust what SLSA is, but what people are saying about their environments. Like if they say they're 3 or 4, what does that really mean? And I'm part of me, and this will put my hand down because I'm not sure how to bring it up yet, is concerned that we're solving the how versus the why or the what first. It just feels like we're we've got 1.0 out now, and there's some questions around, well, well, what does this really mean? And we're talking about tooling and various things without actually talking about, well, how do we establish the trust? So I put my hand down because I wasn't sure how to express what I was feeling there when we were talking about that. So we can just drop it for now. I'll bring it back up when I can think better about it.
No, I think that's a good point. Personally, I think a lot of emphasis and questions seem to be on like, how do we transfer trust across organizations? Like, you have a vendor and they are doing something, and how do you verify that they are definitely technically doing this? And there's, like, can we do attestations or like trusted computing or something like that? I would lean towards like, that is a hard problem, and there's kind of lower hanging fruit to solve that, like doing, and I don't think we do a good job of this on the site now, and I want to figure out how we could better do this. I want to get more in, we currently have the salsa.dev/use cases. And I would like to better emphasize that, like, you could use salsa just within your organization. You don't have to convince anyone else. You're only trying to convince yourself. And so that's like a valid thing, and like organizations can do that today, and you don't have to solve any of those problems. And if you, yeah, David.
I love security. I think everyone should be doing security because it's the best thing to do. And this is the security versus compliance discussion in a moment. As the federal mandate is driving SBOMs, I see salsa to me picked up speed when I saw, well, okay, we have SBOMs, but what are we going to do about it? Why are we doing it? How do we attest to that? Salsa is answering that question for me. If we can't trust people are going to do salsa because it's the best thing to do. Honestly, I don't. There are organizations and teams that will. I just, there's going to be driven into it. People are busy, and we need to give them an incentive to why should they do this, because somebody's going to mandate it somewhere, and we want to make sure we're aligned, and salsa is the answer for that why. At least that's what I'm seeing. I'm not altruistic. I love security. I just don't think people are going to do it in the goodness of their heart. Saw a couple of thumbs up. So
Yeah, if I could add to that, yeah, I second David's point. I think it might be worth taking the time. Maybe this is a blog post, but it might be worth taking the time looking at SSDF requirements and how Salsa can help meet that, especially the provenance. Missed something. Thanks, Melba.
So there is a blog post. We have to update it for 1.0, but there was at least one or two around that topic of, well, there's this White House executive order, there's SSDF. How does SLSA map to that? So one of the tracks on the positioning group is updating that blog post so that it is mapping to the current 1.0, because right now that blog post is for version 0.1. So potentially we can do that in this next round.
Kind of bring it back to Andrew's original point about what we are, like plans and roadmap. I think it seems like it would probably be a good idea if we had a place where we could iterate on stuff that's like not ready to be published, like the future source track, higher build levels, a future dependency track. And all those kind of like half-baked versions. That seems like that might be a good approach, just from like how do we present this information so people can kind of see like what is the current work in progress. And then folks who kind of work you know, as people, you know, have an interest in working on something like, oh, I want to try to resolve the source track. You know, we can make progress there and people can see it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because just having a scratch pad or a development space to work, maybe somebody wants to try and clarify. Well, like I opened an issue where I feel like there might be we might have to figure out something with the builder ID being unique between the different salsa levels, because it could be possible that you'd fall back to salsa 3 if some user specific input for salsa 4 doesn't work. So like if you want to try and figure out what it means to be build salsa 4 and maybe what effect that has in the provenance builder ID, then you have a space to do that without modifying the published specification.
I want to go back a little bit to the comments from KubeCon, tie into this a little bit. And the fact that people felt this was a SaaS or be hard for the on-prem, and it feels almost like, you know, we went from that into a tooling conversation. But I'm going through, as we're talking, I'm kind of going through the spec, kind of reading things from like how would somebody attest to this? And it got me thinking about, in my expertise was more in the PCI space. I referred to that a lot and things, but the PCI space says, here's the evidence you need to gather. Now, PCI messed up because they didn't allow for a digital way of gathering it and having tools for automation, and we can solve that piece. But if we're looking at the spec, is there, and I apologize because I missed a couple of meetings with travel and things over the last few weeks. Where are we with actually turning some of these things into, you know, how do we go from saying how you do something to how do you say you've done that? You know, what sort of evidence is a minimum level of evidence to specify that, with or without a tool to gather it? You know, how do we, because I'm concerned people are thinking this only can be done with SaaS because but again, SaaS providers don't share how they do the back end. So I'm curious of that.
Yeah, so I think that's actually one of the questions about how some of the stuff in the conformance program, and this was also something that was brought up a couple of weeks ago. I'm blanking on the name of the person who brought this up, around the build, like something like a build system track or a build service track, something like, hey, you meet these sorts of requirements based on, let's say, this evidence, you know, and that kind of thing. Goes, you know, like whatever is required to do that, and we haven't really defined really outside of saying, you know, run it in a trusted control plane, and you should be doing some of these basic things. I think the thing that has kind of come out of that, though, was a little bit of like, if I'm a giant company and I sell CI as a service, it's very easy for me as a provider to provide, you know, somebody came in, did an audit or whatever, however I provide that information, I provide that to the public. You know, whereas a lot of folks were like, wait, does that mean me as an enterprise, I need to use one of these SaaSes because I can't provide enough information publicly for some reason or another? Like that's kind of where I think a lot of the confusion lies. And then also for a lot of folks who said like, hey, I run a small company, my CI system is something I run internally, but in order for me to do, you know, all this reporting, we're a small company, I can't do all this reporting, blah, blah, blah. Like, what does that look like? How do you make that easier for the end user? I think is for these smaller organizations that are like selling software or whatever.
Yeah, I'm coming at this from a big company perspective. So I realize I'm biased here. I guess when I think about this, of like when we consume software, like what would it take for us to be confident that someone is doing this? I mean, there's also better is the enemy of good here. That like right now we don't have anything. And so putting it into contracts probably goes a long way. That like you must do this. And like when, I guess it's, you know, I also think it's probably similar to how you select a vendor for anything else. Like if you, for example, if you're going to use a cloud hosting provider, many customers want some sort of documentation or other claims from the company that they are following certain practices. This is how we architect our system. These are our procedures. This is how we do this. They, you know, they'll respond to specific customer requests to give them confidence that, you know, they're meeting all their security needs. And you're able to do that without actually letting the customer come in and like query things and look at source code. So I guess I maybe naively was imagining at least it could start out sort of like that. That not as much of a, you know, we could start simply as a informal thing, and then you know, make it more rigid as needed. Also, Chris, I don't know if you want to, since this kind of goes into the conformance program. Is Chris here?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I'm listening to this conversation. I'm not entirely sure what to say because I believe that securing a build platform is a fundamentally hard task, and it will not be easy, especially for small companies. And sometimes it's worth paying other companies for a service. I find it odd to shy away from that.
So to be clear, I agree with that general premise of, hey, it's hard to secure. I don't think it's necessarily that. I think the thing is, when you look at a lot of smaller companies that are like, hey, I'm doing all the right things, but I don't have a whole team that can run a conformance program or yada yada to kind of prove that to the world, or how do I prove that to the world, is kind of a bigger thing. And I also like, one of the things that was a very clear perception from a lot of the folks at KubeCon was SLSA is something that can only be handled by, like, they look at the, you know, I don't mean this like as an accusation, but like a lot of folks sort of look at a lot of the people who are key contributors here, and they go and say, oh, you have folks from, you know, GitHub, you have folks from Google. Oh, great, I see it's something to push GCB or something to push GitHub Actions. That's not, you know, I recognize that that's not the case, right? It's all about actual security. I think the thing here, though, is I think we have a almost like a duty to make it sure that it's easy enough for other folks to still do.
Yeah, I guess, like, you know, kind of coming back to what I was saying about how you select a vendor. I think if I were selecting a vendor and they were a small company, that probably switching to a cloud, well, I don't know if it's small or big, it matters, but like, there are some advantages to having a single hosted build provider, right? Because like, as a customer, don't have to evaluate each one individually. I could just say, okay, I've already evaluated XYZ company. If you're using them, I just know that they're doing the right thing. I think also, I wonder if, like, especially for small organizations, like on the order of like 2-digit number of people, I'm not sure how much value there is in switching that, because a lot of this is around how we could scale security Because like you're trying to remove trust and like not have to trust everything for individual developers, because like across like many organizations, many people, it's hard to know that everyone's doing the right thing. But in a small company where you know everyone, I'm not sure how much. Well, yeah, I guess I don't know. Maybe I'll shut up because I don't know what I'm talking about. Go ahead, Chris.
So following the chat, it sounds like I should say I'm not familiar with PCI, but it sounds like my proposal for the conformance program is sorry, Josh is in my proposal for the conformance program is somewhat similar in that there is a survey. You can fill it out yourself and publish it on your website, or you can pay somebody to inspect your system and fill it out for you and give it their stamp of approval. So maybe it's worth looking at the proposal, and because I did, in all fairness, drop it Friday afternoon, so I assume nobody's read it. But maybe that would be a good place to ground a future discussions about conformance.
We should all make a point of reading it. I just wanted to add the point that, between talking about like big shops and small shops, we should also not forget maybe there's something in between, like open source communities, like let's say Debian. They probably will continue to maintain their own private build servers. I know PyPI has talked about someday building their own wheels build farm. So we have to keep those in mind also.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I actually think that Chris's proposal is mostly there, and I think the thing, right, is like, yeah, as somebody who's also done PCI compliance, right, like there's certain things that absolutely, right, if you are a payment, like if you're one of the big payment processors like a Visa or a MasterCard, right, you're going to be under a much stricter sort of set of requirements compared to, hey, I'm a small shop that just so happens to accept credit card payments, right? I think the thing is, from our end, I just think it's less about the actual content and more about how we message and communicate that content, and how do we make sure that folks recognize through something like examples or similar, so that they don't just assume, oh, I can only do this via GitHub, right? And a lot of it has less to do with anything other than just like if you look at the blogs or you look at the projects under Salsa framework, people go and say, oh, everything seems to be geared towards GitHub. I was like, no, there's other ones out there, right? And I pointed folks in the direction of some of the other things, like because we have that Jenkins plugin that Samsung had contributed, and there's Fresca, and there's Tecton chains, and there's all that sort of stuff. I just think it's I think more of a communication and messaging problem.
Any more thoughts? Okay. All right, so it sounds like we should call it a day then. Okay. All right, well, it's good seeing everyone. We'll talk to you either online or see you next week.